Hello and salam to everyone. I am Shamsuddin Hassan Shigari from Pakistan. I am here with a very special guest, Professor Alexander Key. He is a PhD in Islamic Studies and Arabic Literature, mashallah, and currently assistant professor at Stanford University. Many scholarly articles and research articles have been published in international research journals. And Dr. Key has a very important book, which is a very internationally famous book. That book is Language Between God and the Poets. We had a very detailed discussion, so I felt that just as he has knowledge, especially the basic subjects related to linguistic, his philosophical discussions too. Dr. Key has access to them. So my desire was to introduce Dr. Key in front of you people. So I thank him very much for giving us time for this channel of ours. At this time, some scholars of Karachi are sitting with me, and among them, Madam Farah Saeed, Madam Arjuman Umar, Madam Sania Umar, and Mr. Umar Ahsan Khan are present, and Temur Saeed is with us, and so on. Dear Mr. Hamza Saeed, inshallah, we have some questions from all of them. So we will take one question from each one in turn, and the professor will answer it. And then, if I get time from him, I will do another session in which I will ask him only in Arabic, inshallah. If there will be a discussion, I think the first question will be asked by Madam Farah Said Saiba.
Very nice to meet you. So, I would like to know what are your reasons for interest in Arabic literature and the Islamic studies?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's great to be here. It's an honor to be with Stairs. Thanks to Omar for his, and you all for your hospitality. It's a story where it was a series of coincidences. It was a university I didn't think I would be lucky enough to get into in England. It was a rejection from a university that I thought I would be able to get into. And then it was a random choice of a language to go with politics. One had to study a language with international relations, and I just picked Arabic on the basis of a nice picture in a book. And so at the time, I thought I was very original, and I was breaking the mold, and I was getting out of the small English northern village that I grew up in, and studying Arabic, and it was unique. And then, of course, decades later, I realized that I was just the latest iteration along the train tracks of the British colonial enterprise, or then later the British kind of post-colonial enterprise of failure. Whereas Britain used to send its young, bored men out to the subcontinent as part of the colonial project to extract resources with violence. And then by the time I was 18, it was 1920, it was sending them out to do, human rights and democracy. But it was the same, colonial, post-colonial train. So I wasn't as original as I thought I was. I was just following the kind of train tracks.
So that is when your first encounter with the Arabic language. So you took it up just because it was a requirement at that time?
Yeah.
And then once you started studying it, the interest developed then? You felt that you found it interesting?
Yeah, my first teacher, Professor Julia Bray, just gave us all the sense that this was really serious, like really serious, like not a language that you just pick up, but a serious kind of intellectual enterprise that was going to take real work and had real value. And, the class was 22, 20, 30 people in first year. And by the time we got to fourth year, I think there were 3 of us.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. But the 3 of, she gave us a sense that it was a serious thing. And then I went to Birzeit University in Palestine for a summer. And then I went and taught English in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon for 2 summers. And I took a course on the Quran, and I took 1 course on classical Arabic literature. And then I went and got a job eventually after struggling to get a job in London for a while. I got an internship in Palestine, in Nazareth, working with a human rights organization. And after a couple of years, I got a job in Jerusalem working with a Palestinian development organization. And then when my now wife, then girlfriend, was going back to America, she's Korean American, she was going back to America to law school, I applied to graduate school. And it was this choice, do I study development? Do I study kind of contemporary politics? And it was 2004-05, and things were bad in Palestine then, and I was like, no way do I want to study the modern world. I want to go and study the exciting ideas that I encountered at university from the past. So then I applied to kind of Arabic and Islamic Studies PhD programs, and that was it.
Okay, that was it. So initially it was your teacher, the first teacher, she inspired you to pursue the language. And then Islamic Studies followed. The interest in the language led you to the Islamic Studies then as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really a matter of being excited by a kind of intellectual and artistic world and culture that seemed like the more one read, the more there was to read, and the more kind of complex and beautiful resources were there for thinking about, life, meaning, poetry.
And of course,
you can't, like, the Islam is like a central part of that. Like, there's just no sense in which,
That's true.
There's just no sense in which that's not central to all the conversations. So obviously,
that came with it, kind of.
Yeah. I was, I've been doing I've been on a committee at Stanford for the last year dealing with the sort of current campus climate, and it's the Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian Communities Committee, and I'm one of the co-chairs. And my other co-chair, her family's from Karachi, and she grew up in the Gulf, and then she did a PhD in America. And we're joking, like, Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian. Between the 2 of us, we're 1 for 6. Like, she's Muslim but not Arab or Palestinian, and I'm not Muslim, not Arab, and not Palestinian. but I guess, we were talking about it, and it's like I kind of, after all this time, the tradition that I think with most, the ideas that I think with most, are all Islamic.
Right.
Like, it's the tradition I know best, I think it's fair to say.
And you have a book titled Language Between God and the Poets. So could you just explain to us briefly what the main theme of this book is?
So on the one hand, it's a very kind of narrow academic focus, in the sense that it's a few hundred pages about maybe 1.5 words. On the other hand, and it's just sort of 1 century, the sort of 5th century Hijri, 11th century Miladi. On the other hand, the word that I'm looking at is an Arabic word that's kind of equivalent to meaning. So it's really a book about how language and meaning function,
Right.
which is a big topic. And it goes to kind of the most basic underpinnings of how we communicate with each other, how we think about science, how we think about the divine, how we think about language, how we know what words mean,
Right.
how we can think logically with words, and then also how we can think poetically and about beauty and about how words can be beautiful.
Right.
So I take four famous people, one of them who wrote dictionaries, as well as tafsir and adab, Raghib al-Isfahani, one scholar of kalam, so theology, Ibn Furak al-Ash'ari, who also wrote tafsir, and some fiqh, a logician, a philosopher, Ibn Sina,
Okay.
and a scholar of poetry and language, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani. And I look at these kind of very different disciplines, and I try and argue that they share a common vocabulary for thinking about language and how words work. And I guess, I don't maybe say this particularly explicitly in the book, but this came up in a conversation we were having earlier. I think that the ideas that I'm reporting on are valuable in and of themselves. And I think that the way of thinking about how language and mind and reality interact in these 11th century Arabic texts is useful for today.
Yes.
Like, I think it compares well with, European intellectual history. It helps me make sense. The ideas they have help me make sense of how words work in a way that, contemporary Anglophone philosophy of language hasn't, helped me as much.
So this has opened up, different avenues for you. It's enriched your understanding of other things as well. So
yeah, I would
Thank
almost
you.
say better avenues, and I would
Oh,
say kind of like the thinking with Islamic concepts. Like, I now think about language with these Arabic concepts, and I think that's more effective just for thinking about language than trying to think about language with an English philosophy of language concepts.
Because you
Yeah.
find that it's richer, the Arab philosophy.
I'm not even sure richer. It's more practical and effective,
Okay,
more sophisticated,
that's very
more
interesting.
rigorous.
अगला सवाल इंशाल्लाह करेंगे हमारे उमर हसन खान साहब.
Great to meet you again, Alexander. And a very interesting story you've shared so far about how you got connected to the Arabic language and what that and how that led you into writing this book. So my question to you would be, what are some of the ancient and modern debates about the relationship between word and meaning?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm tempted to tell, and this is a little bit of an exaggeration, in the way that it's a little bit of an exaggeration. But if you think of the Mediterranean across history and Africa and West Asia and Europe, the oldest discussions of language we have is Plato's Cratylus, where in this Platonic dialogue, they're trying to work out where words come from and what words mean. Like, do words mean what they mean because they sound like things, like onomatopoeia, a babbling brook, a bang, or are words kind of just delivered by God all at once, or are words just developed slowly across time? And Plato's Cratylus doesn't really have the answers. It just tells us that people were thinking about this stuff. And then if you kind of cycle through European intellectual history, you get, jump to William of Ockham and nominalism and the idea that kind of words are just made up and they don't have any connection to the ideas they talk about. And then, you wind through sort of the philosophy of language and then, Frege and logic. And I took a philosophy of language course at Stanford. that was fascinating. And it ended up with the students each had to give a presentation, not on what they'd studied, but on kind of a new idea for how they could think about how language works, how words mean things. And so I hadn't told anyone in the class that I was actually a professor. Like, I was just kind of pretending to be a student. I think they found out at the end, and then they stopped marking my essays. It's probably good. But so I gave a presentation based on the Arabic kind of theories of language and meaning that I'd been working on. This idea of how language and mind and reality fit together. And when I gave this presentation in the class, they loved it. Like, they were like, wow, this is really great. Like, this is great philosophy. This is a great idea, they said. You know, I was talking about how for the Arabic, I was talking about how you can think of just a single level of physical language, like the vibrations of air that come out of our mouths, the scratches on the page. And then you have that. And then you have a level of ideas, like cognitive content in our minds that's potentially shared between different people. And then all language does is connect the two at different times and places. It just, people make different connections deliberately, and and that's it. That's language.
But can I ask you a follow-on that one? So in your view, and based on obviously all the teaching that you've been doing and all the research that you've been doing, where is the meaning? Is it in the text? Is it in the listener's mind? Or is it in the speaker's mind? Where do you think is the meaning, real meaning of what's being said?
Yeah. So on this, and that's the kind of question that this class was asking, and the answer that the kind of Arabic system would put forward is that the contents, like the ideas, they're what matter. And they are already in our heads, shared between different people, and universal across all languages. So like the ideas don't need kind of translation. And if we could just communicate without using language, it would be great, because we could just zoom into each other's minds. And indeed, if you read, tafsir, and you listen to and you read some of the discussions of prophetic revelation and wahi, that's one model. But God can communicate like that. Humans can't communicate like that. So really, you need language. This process of like making vibrations in the air or scratching on the page to work out between each other which of the different pre-existing ideas you're pointing at. So I guess like what's interesting about the word meaning in English is that it sort of covers up that process with a word meaning that sort of implies that it all comes together. But the clarity of the Arabic structure is it says no, and there's no meaning. There's just these two levels and connections at different points in time. Then the end of the story of the class is that they were all excited and they came up to me afterwards. Where'd you get this great idea? And I was like, I read it, in my research. And as soon as they knew that it was historical, they lost interest. Because they were like, we don't do history. We're trying to think of philosophy. We're not interested in other people's ideas. And it was a crazy kind of moment. And I think that's kind of an analogy to come back to your first question, that's kind of an analogy for where the contribution of Arabic and Islamic philosophy of language is. It's so complex and sophisticated and multi-century and multi-continent, and it's all there in these books. But this, Plato to modernity in Europe channel has just missed it out completely.
So can I just connect this to one more thing? So when we look at religious text, and not only Islamic religious text, any religious text, obviously there's a lot of history behind in anyone's mind when they're reading religious text, and the level of understanding and background knowledge that someone would have would be very different between a religious person and a so-called a non or a less religious person. So how should they then go about this in terms of trying to understand the meaning? Because without that background, which a religious person might have, so the meanings will totally change, right? Depending on what amount of background knowledge you have about that subject. And then in religion, it becomes even more difficult because obviously there's a lot of social norms that might exist. As someone grows up, you grow up listening to a lot of stuff, right? And there are social norms, there's history. So how does then one go about getting to that meaning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to extricate these questions from like particular social and political moments. So you find a lot of people in the sort of Arabic Islamic archive. You know, you think of Farabi, Baghdad. It's the 900s, and his answer to that question is relentlessly elitist. Like, it's just, look, there are complex ideas here that you need to be very sophisticated and educated to understand. And if you're not very sophisticated and educated, you just need to keep quiet and trust people in authority. And maybe these people in authority will give you some metaphors that you can grasp. That's it. And this is a very hierarchical, elitist way of thinking, that is kind of inextricable from that context in which Farabi was working. It was a pretty hierarchical society. There was a reasonably large amount of inequality. And he was a very, ambitious and successful scholar. And then, you look at another, you look at, say, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, I always get my dates muddled. Slightly earlier than Al-Farabi. When does Ahmad ibn Hanbal die? Anyway, well, not that dissimilar, but a much more popularly accessible way of thinking about encountering religion, based more on received oral knowledge that isn't restricted to an elite, right? Like, the hadith that Ahmad is working with are not only owned by the elite, they're owned by a larger variety of people, and they give people a way to think about the right things to do practically on a daily basis that are accessible to them. And so that's like it's less intellectual, it's less rarefied, and it's less hierarchical, than Farabi's approach to answer your question. And then, maybe somebody like Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi would be a sort of in between the two, with the way that he leans into tasawwuf and Sufism and gives and says, it's not quite as simple as just sort of memorizing the teachings of what actions to do from available authorities, but it isn't as sophisticated and hierarchical as Farabi would do. It's a matter in the end of piety. It's a matter of piety and commitment, and a level of piety and commitment to action and thought that is going to get you to the right place in the end. So I think, maybe I kind of dodged the question by picking three people from the kind of pre-modern Arabic world, but different solution, like different kinds of solutions to that essential kind of universal question.
अब अगला सवाल करेंगी मोहतरमा सनिया साहिबा। आपने माशाल्लाह से मास्टर किया है नफ्सियात में जी, थोड़ा सा आप ये बताएंगी कि आपने कहाँ से किया है, आपका मजमून क्या है, फिर आप सवाल कीजिएगा।
Thank you. So as sir mentioned, I did my undergraduate in psychology in London, and then I stayed there for my master's, which I also did in mental health sciences at King's College. And I've been here since I'm working in healthcare. So my question today is, what, in your opinion, are the causes of a negative perception of Islam in the West? And are there any efforts being made in the West by Muslim and both non-Muslim researchers to change this perception?
I mean, I think the reason is the West, right? I mean, it's like, the historical answer, and this is not, lots of people have said this other than me, is that Europe, like even before, like the colonial expansion to North America, Europe constituted itself by rejecting a Semitic other, by rejecting like both Jews and like everybody else in West Asia. And like that's how they knew that's how Europe imagined itself. Like we know we're European and we know we're Christian because we're not like this vast kind of complex civilization, vast, complex, rich, powerful civilizations in South Asia and in the southern shores of the Mediterranean. So, you can easily say that, European and then Anglophone civilization is inherently, Islamophobic. I have a lot of sympathy for that. And then I think that the subsequent colonial projects are inherently racist. Like that's the whole point. Like you can't extract the resources of another country to benefit your country through violence without an ideology that enables you to do that. And that ideology has to be like an ideology of cultural superiority and racism. And indeed, it's in those colonial projects that race itself, the modern concept of race, is invented. Like it's the colonial projects, it's slavery that starts a really new modern project of taking humanity and slicing it up in particular hierarchies. This is not to say that, no racial difference or violence happened before modernity or before the European colonial project. No, we don't want to make the argument that everything was sunny and great and everyone was friends, except for colonialism. But certainly the invention of modern race is part of that process. So I think there's this kind of long history, long kind of inevitable history, because it's that's kind of more available than other models that might allow humans to sort of negotiate power and difference and wealth in multi-ethnic, multilingual realities. I mean, what else did I say? And I should also, now I'm giving this long answer, mention the nation state. Again, a particular European invention that made sense in Europe at a particular moment in time. But if you look at the vast sweep of human history, it's kind of anomalous. This idea that you have kind of one ethnicity that has one language and it's in this one place and there's a border around it. And then you have to translate out of it, and you have foreigners. This is very specific to European history. It doesn't tell you anything about the history of West Asia. It doesn't tell you anything about where I live at the moment, California. I mean, is California white? No, it's minority white. Is it no, it's a mix of English and Spanish. What do I hear on campus? I hear Farsi, Spanish, English, Chinese. humans have kind of always lived in multilingual, multi-ethnic places where there's a lot of money and power have tended to have people from all over coming. Like, this isn't a new thing. And yeah, that's a kind of different model to the nation state. And, you know, yeah, again, the nation state is going to be, you know, especially like Anglophone and European, is going to have a Christian default, and then it's going to be inherently Islamophobic. The second part of your question, yes, like huge amount, as you had, we all know, like the amount of both, you know, kind of, what's the way, you know, what's the right word? People who write, you know, I'm trying not to make it sound pejorative. Authors of, you know, popular works, not in a bad way, you know, writing about, like, you know, Islamic history, Mustafa Akyol, Reza Aslan, like people who are trying to communicate to a broad non-academic readership about, you know, Islamic history and civilization. And then, you know, academics, you know, Asma Sadruddin writing about jihad, all the way up to, you know, Shahab Ahmad's book on Islam. Yeah, I mean, you would say that both Muslim academics in the West and across the world and non-Muslim academics, there's a lot of work is being done. And I think, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think if you look at, you know, a moment like that we're at Stanford at the moment, the sense that we've got, like the work we've been doing over the last year or two on the campus climate, and thinking about is, you know, if Trump gets elected, is there going to be another Muslim ban, and how is the university going to react to that? And then comparing that to how, like, what the discourse on Palestine is like. I mean, I think there has, you know, some progress has been made. I think, you know, Stanford did stand up for its Muslim students in the last Muslim ban, and will stand up for them again if there's another one. Like, which is different from, like, the early years of the 9/11 decade, you know, when the FBI was doing trainings on Islam that were basically just threat, racism, threat. I think, you know, some progress has been made, but it takes, you know, the constant work of lots of people, and, you know, and in the end, you know, I'm faintly pessimistic about humans who will always kind of gravitate towards hatred and violence and prejudice.
Yeah.
You know. They don't read enough books.
अगला सवाल इंशाल्लाह करेंगे मोहतरमा अर्जुमन साहिबा, आप तो आपका भी जो सवाल है आप कीजिए.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so welcome to Pakistan, and it's a pleasure meeting you. My question to you is that so far, actually, if you look at human history, they have been, as humans, we've been expressing ourselves in, like, you know, either poetry or prose or free verse.
Mm-hmm.
But when we read Quran, we really don't see it has prose or poetry. At times it appears as poetry, but it's not poetry, it's not prose, it's not free verse. But with your vast experience and work, you've spent decades on it. So what do you think Quran is? Like, you know, how do you term Quran? Is it poetry? It's a book of poetry, or book of prose, or what? Or it's something different?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not poetry because it says it's not poetry. Like,
Yes.
very clear. I mean, I think that, and again, like, who am I to say? I'm going to lean on the scholar who I did my dissertation on, Raghib al-Isfahani, who you know, dies in about, you know, 410 Hijri, like, you know, 980 Miladi. And he asks exactly the same question, and he has a chapter on I'jaz al-Quran, how the Quran is inimitable and unique at the beginning of his tafsir, in kind of the introduction to his tafsir. And he says, we have these genres of literature, like we have rhymed prose, saj, that we use for speeches, and we use it for, introductions and things. And then we have poetry. He doesn't recognize free verse, of course, because shi'r is shi'r al-amudi with the rhyme. Free verse is only going to be invented in Arabic in the 20th century, like Nasq al-Malaika in Iraq. And then we have prose. So we have prose, poetry, and rhymed verse. And then he just says, the Quran is inimitable, like in the sense that God in the Quran challenges humanity to replicate it, and they fail to replicate it. And it's inimitable because it's in this unique nazm, it's in this unique kind of structure that is separate from all these other genres. So in a sense, the answer to the question is the genre of the Quran is the Quran. Okay. Full stop.
Oh, beautiful. Yes.
Yeah, and that's his answer. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
अगला सवाल करेगा हमारा हमजा सईद साहब। आप इस कनाडा की कौन सी यूनिवर्सिटी में? यॉर्क यूनिवर्सिटी के तालिब इल्म हैं और माशाल्लाह से टाइकोंडो के नेशनल चैम्पियन, ऐसा ही है, पाकिस्तान के, और कई मेडल्स आपने जीते हैं। तो अपनी तालीम के साथ साथ आपका जो दूसरा मशगला वो ये है, तो इल्म से और इन चीज़ों से, फ़िक्री मसाइल वगैरह से भी बहुत गहरा इनका ताल्लुक़ है। तो इनका भी एक सवाल है, वो हम लेते हैं।
Good to see you. It's very fortunate meeting you. And my question would be, how do you view the Quran as a non-Muslim researcher in terms of literary text and answer to man's big questions?
Yeah, I think we were talking before, I grew up in a Christian environment, like where my school was a Christian, it was a church school, elementary school, and then a church school at high school with prayers every day. And then my university was like a university that had carols and Christian singing and stuff. But my parents were not religious. Like my mum was very fervently kind of atheist, and my dad was somewhere in between. So I wasn't brought up kind of religious. And like I was saying, like now the amount of time I've spent reading the Islamic tradition and the Quran, it's the tradition I know best. I would say that I knew the Quran better than I know the Bible, substantially better. And it's in the end, belief is a personal thing, and I admire people who have the confidence of belief, I think is the way I would say. And I don't quite have that confidence. I would say I'm just not sure. And that I would say also that I probably, when I think about it, end up approaching the Quran like through the texts of all the people that I'm working on who are working with the Quran. And so the book I'm translating at the moment, Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani's Dala'il al-I'jaz, is a book about the Quran and about language. And it's a book that Abdul Qahir wrote to explain, and this is kind of a follow-on to the previous question, he was kind of saying, look, it's not quite enough to say that the Quran is inimitably beautiful because it's the Quran and it has a unique nazm, it has a unique structure. He was like, we have to explain exactly how that structure works, and only then will we be able to show how it's more beautiful. And it's a very persuasive argument. He says, I'm going to explain through showing you how syntax works and how sentences work, and how sentences make us feel different things as we move through them. I'm going to show you how like some poetry is better than other poetry, and I'm going to show you how the Quran is more beautiful than other human forms of literature. So it's really like, yeah, it's not literary, you know. It's like, if you define literature as sort of not if you were to kind of define, if you think of, say, adab, I mean, would somebody say the Quran was adab? No, maybe not really. You know, it would be useful in ta'deeb, in educating, you know, because of its divine status. But it's not adab literature, you know, it's not kind of full of jokes and diversions and, you know, jid and hazal. It's God speaking. Yes, I guess I probably wouldn't really approach it as literature in the non-religious sense, if that makes sense. No.
So what about as answers to man's big questions? Would you then look at it as more of a, wouldn't call it philosophy, but where would you place it then? Seeing that it's not a literary text.
It's hard to know. I mean, I think, again, like, who am I to say, right? I mean, on a very deep level, like, who am I? It's not, my opinion is not worth much here. I mean, I think for me, what makes it so important is that it's a reference point for so many other disciplines. Like, it's a reference point and kind of an underpinning for so many other kind of ways of thinking. It provides like a vocabulary and a set of ideas that are, you know, that enable lots and lots of people doing lots of different things in lots of different places to kind of think with that.
Define a whole tradition, essentially.
Right.
Which would lead into the next question, which was, have you studied the Quran from any other point of view other than a literary text? But I think we've kind of already answered that.
Yeah, and I've got a lot out of reading tafsir over the years, like, because I think the tafsir tradition is absolutely kind of fascinating and fundamental. You know, and for me, you know, as a non-Muslim, and also for me as a teacher, you know, trying to teach, you know, the Quran trying to teach the Quran or trying to teach Arabic or Islamic, tafsir is really, really where you always go. Like, there's so much in the tafsir tradition, like everything from, you know, tafsir al-Jalalain that just gives you one or two words that helps you work out what it means, to, you know, Zamakhshari, who's writing these long philosophical analyses of the language, to Tabari, who's giving you this deep history, to Ibn Kathir, who's giving you the history, to, you know, there's so many different options in there. Yeah, that would be my tafsir would be my answer.
अगला सवाल करेंगी मोहतरमा फ़रा सईद साहिबा। मैंने पहले इनका तारुफ कराना मुझसे रह गया। आपने माशाल्लाह से इस्लामिक स्टडीज़ में एमए किया है और उसके बाद उससे पहले ख़ुद से बहुत मेहनत से अरबी सीखी, फिर तर्जुमा और कुछ कोर्सेज़ वगैरह सारे किए और अब माशाल्लाह से कराची यूनिवर्सिटी में गालिबन एमफिल कर रही है। आप एमफिल रिसर्च स्कॉलर है, तो इंशाल्लाह उम्मीद है वो फिर कोई फ़लसफ़ियाना सवाल ही करेंगी।
Thank you. What, in your opinion, is deconstructionism? And related to the same question is, what do you think of its application in the reading and interpretation of the Holy Quran? Or, I mean, I'd rather say religious texts, not just the Quran. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, deconstruction is interesting because, on the one hand, it's this very particular European moment. You know, it's France, it's the 70s. They just had like a revolution and a riot in Paris in 1968. And somebody like, you know, Derrida, who's like the most kind of famous, you know, deconstructionist. And I should say, this is not my area of like deep expertise. but nevertheless, let me,
We'll
give
still
some-
benefit a lot from
some
it,
hot
yeah.
takes. Derrida's whole thing was that texts don't mean what they say they mean. Like, they're really just like a game that we are playing with them as readers. And this idea that they have like an argument or that they say something is just, it just breaks down too quickly. And there's too much kind of irony and contradiction. And so really, yeah, they say this texts say they're saying something, but they're actually saying something else. And we're part of that process of what else they're saying. So what Derrida would do, and people often forget this, I don't know, is he would just read classical European philosophy, like the classical European philosophy he was trained on, Hegel, Kant, Herder, the big famous texts. And then he would write these articles and give these lectures where he would just pull them apart. He would just completely pull them apart. He would be like, this word has started to mean something different. This word has started, and he would make these connections that the text didn't. He would deconstruct them. And then he would kind of, through this process of very close reading of specific words, pull out all these things that he knew that Kant or Hegel did not actually mean to say. And this is a very kind of fun and interesting exercise, right? I mean, you can't do that. With the Quran, which is, literally God's word. Like, I mean, again, it's that discussion we were having before where Islamic theologians were for many centuries very concerned with how rational it was to try and explain what God was doing. When God had created the whole system, it was kind of crazy for people to be thinking that they could use their human ideas to explain what God was saying. So Islamic theology has this long kind of discussion, the Mu'tazila, the Ash'ari, and Hanabila. So really, I mean, the gap is sort of, you can't possibly see how you could, The only way you could do a deconstructionist reading of the Quran was if you were absolutely convinced that, the Quran wasn't true.
Right.
Yeah, you couldn't. I mean, it's a really interesting question. Like, I mean, or no, put it this way, because if you think of Derrida's attitude to European intellectual history, he doesn't want to reject it. He wants to play with it, let's say. But there's some level where, I mean, I think it would be theologically inappropriate to say that the Quran is a text we can play with, because that would be the kind of playing with the divine creator that wouldn't make any sense. Like, it would just be kind of illogical and wrong. Like, why would God create something that would then think it knew what God was saying better than God? Like, it doesn't make sense. But the last thing I would say is that, the deconstructionism is this particular thing that happens in Europe at a moment where the Catholicism and Protestantism not particularly strong. Communism is very important. It's 1968 has just happened. We're in European modernity, and deconstruction comes up, and then it goes to America, and Derrida is very popular and it's very fashionable, and it fits the time.
Okay.
The 60s.
Right.
And so it's kind of hard to think of it outside that time. If you take all the sort of anti-religion out of deconstruction, and you think of it just as a way of reading really closely, then you can look at, again, you can look at tafsir, and you can look at what tafsir does with the Quran,
Right.
and it's very close attention to meaning and the way people can do so much with a single ayah.
Yes.
And it's a kind of analogous process, but there's a very different, Derrida is writing in this world where God is dead. Nietzsche says God is dead, we have killed him. And that's 100 years before Derrida. So Derrida's working in that world, Ruth Bihan Balqi, is writing in Iran, in a completely different world,
Right.
But this sense that, maybe the way you could be like that, one thing we can do with texts that we really value is read them very closely. Yeah, well, be sure.
So in that sense, I think the Quran has been deconstructed. If we don't, apply that exact same term as Derrida's, but it has been, interpreted differently, and it's been read very closely with, hair-splitting debates and everything. And people have, come up with different, understandings, different interpretations. So does that kind of is that kind of the same thing, or it's not?
I think
people have come up with very different understandings of the same text.
Yeah.
The sects, the sects that are there, they're still, evolved over a period of so many years.
Yeah, I think that I would want to keep the word deconstruction just to because the thing about deconstruction is it doesn't trust the text.
Okay.
Right?
So you
the whole point is that you don't trust the text to say what it's saying.
Right.
And I think I would want to keep that separate from tafsir. I really would. Because
separate from religious text.
Yeah. Derrida could do deconstruction of a religious text, but if Derrida did the deconstructive reading of the Bible, it would be because he didn't believe it, right? Because he didn't believe it was true.
Right.
And then he would pull it apart and show it saying things it didn't say.
So it begins with doubt.
But
you're
not
doubting.
Even doubt.
It's
I would even say
negation, kind of.
I would say an absence of doubt, a certainty that this text is not doing what it says it does.
Right.
Which again, doesn't, I would keep deconstruction in the kind of Derrida's European kind of box.
Oh.
Yeah.
But sir, there is a major problem in Derrida theory. For example, one man who is religious perspective, in the religion, the truth is objective, not subjective. But in the Derrida's theory, the truth will be subjective. It is not a big problem. And if we apply the theory of Derrida for reading holy text, it is not clash between.
Yeah, in the sense that it's okay to have a subjective reading. I don't know. Again, who am I to say? I think I think that, and this is kind of connected to the research that I've done. I think that provide historical genealogies of particular terms and think about them in the context in which they're used. So again, the subjective thing, if I think of the people that I read and work on, I think of Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, who has this very tumultuous career in high politics. He's at the caliph's court, he's with Sahib ibn Abbad, he's popular, he's unpopular, he loses money, he writes books kind of criticizing the politicians. And he's very interested in falsafa. He likes Abu Sulaiman as-Sijistani. But then he goes back at the end of his career to Shiraz, where he grew up, and he writes Al-Isharat al-Ilahiyya, which is a Sufi work about piety and about belief. And it's basically a long prayer. It's like a long dua, a few hundred pages. And I think that, you can look at the way that he thinks about piety and belief and the action of prayer and the personal nature of belief and prayer, and you can say, oh, that kind of looks like it's subjective, But I think that because it's connected to him as a person and his piety and his belief, but I think that would be taking a concept developed in European modernity, this distinction between subjective and objective, and kind of putting it back on Abu Hayyan, because I think if we could do that kind of time travel, right, if we could somehow like fly back through time and meet Abu Hayyan as he's sitting in retirement in Shiraz, writing the Isharat al-Ilahiyya, and if we could explain to him this subjective objective binary, I mean, this is my guess, he would say no, like, this is my piety, but the reason I'm writing these isharat, these like indications, these divine indications, is because I think they're available to everybody, and I think they're true. So he would, I think he would either sort of deny the division between subjective and objective, or he would say that his Islamic piety was objective. I think he would probably reject the idea that it could be called subjective, but we would have to explain to him via time travel what subjective meant. Yeah. Again, like if we went back to Rusbihan Balqi, who's writing a Sufi Shia tafsir in the 1400s in Iran. I'm not sure about that. I always get the dates muddled. And when I teach that tafsir today and students read it, they're like, whoa, he's saying what? It's very different from, where Sunni tafsir is at the moment. But again, I think if we could use time travel and go back and explain to, Rusbihan what deconstruction is, if we could say, 1,000 years from now, 600 years from now, there's going to be this thing called deconstruction, this like method of reading texts. Do you think this applies to you? I think he would say no. I'm not just making stuff up. This isn't my personal opinion. For him, it would be like, these are the haqa'iq. Like, these are the haqa'iq. Like, this is divine. This is what the Quran says. It's objective. It's true for everybody. That would be kind of how he would think about it.
Thank you.
There is a saying of Imam Abu Hanifa, please correct me if I'm wrong, that he said that if my understanding of this verse is this, but if you find a hadith which is contrary to this, if it's contradicting this understanding of mine, then just throw it away, throw it at a wall.
Throw his
understanding.
Yeah.
So I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that they have the scholars in the past, the imams of the past, the great scholars, jurists, they have kind of agreed to disagree as well, but that is something different, right? That's something different from deconstruction, right?
Yeah,
it's just different ways of looking at the text.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is if you look at, exactly. If you look back through the Islamic archive, the scale of disagreement, ikhtilaf, is substantial.
Yes.
And it's self-conscious disagreement.
Right.
People know that they disagree, and people have a whole series of tools to explain how that disagreement works. there are tools in Usul al-Fiqh for explaining how disagreement works. There are tools in theology. There are tools, it's a very there's a book by Thomas Bauer in German in recent years called The Culture of Ambiguity that's making some of these same arguments. Lots of people, Muslim scholars and non-Muslim scholars, and agree with your observation about the scale of difference and disagreement. And I think that, the best way to, I think the best way to deal with it is to, just like you did with the saying from Abu Hanifa, is to conceptualize this disagreement in the way that they conceptualized it. Like, so all the books on ikhtilaf, all the books on, all the hadith about, la tattafiq ummati ala khata, like my community will never agree on an error. Like all those ways of negotiating disagreement whilst maintaining shared belief. The tools are all there in the archive. They're all there. Like they're all there in Islamic history. Like, because they people have had this conversation before, basically, and it's better, I think, to use their vocabulary and their dispute resolution mechanisms than to pull kind of anachronistic, concepts out of other histories. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just one last question. I don't think a conversation like this could be complete without me asking you this question. So you're teaching language and some religious texts, obviously, in there as well, in one of the top universities in the world. But the way I look at it, a lot of the educational system that exists today was designed for the industrial age in the 19th century. Being taught by people who were born and trained in the 20th century. And they're trying to educate kids for the 21st century. That's a big problem. One of the top things that's a part of every conversation today is the modern technology in general and AI in particular. Right? So in your view, now that you're part of one of the top universities, what do you think is the influence that this modern technology in general and AI in particular is going to have on this entire subject of understanding and interpreting Arabic texts and religious texts? And does that worry you as a teacher of these subjects?
Yeah, no. I think what does worry me is the generational disconnect. Like, the older you get, the harder it is to imagine what it's like to think, if you were born in, like, what are our students now? Like, the freshman class for next year are going to be born in
2006,
2006.
Yeah.
I was trying to do
you hadn't even started your PhD.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling. Like, and so that kind of disconnect just gets
that's my concern, right? And I think these kids are more connected to technology, right?
Yeah.
And this technology can take them in any direction. That's where the problem starts.
So I'm kind of constantly worried about the generational disconnect, although I think that generational disconnect will always happen. Like, you read James Joyce, like Portrait of a Young Man. It's about generational disconnect. His teachers are in this different world. He's in a different world. We always have to keep worrying. The good thing about being a university teacher is that you're constantly confronted with younger people.
Exactly.
So you kind of have to keep listening to them to try and work out what's going on and struggling and failing usually. So that is a constant concern. AI, I'm much more cheery about. It's fun to be at Stanford next to all these people who are at the cutting edge of AI, and they know that in the end, this is a very kind of simple technology. Is that all it does is it has one word. If you think of like language generation models, it has one word, and it just looks what the next word should be, and it looks at all the vast amount of data it has, and and makes a prediction, and then it stops, and then it has one word again, and it looks at the next word. It's going word by, in the most sophisticated language model, it's going word by word. And then, yes, it can cross-check, and yes, it has a whole load of things built in, and yeah, it can do like comparisons on a larger scale. But I mean, it's nothing. It's just regurgitating what humans have already said back to us in a very clever way, like no question about it. And it's reflecting all our prejudices and all our mistakes back to us. So AI is very racist not because it's racist, but just because it's trained on these corpuses that are produced by humans that are racist. So it can't ever. And what's kind of funny is seeing like the safety discourse around AI, where they're just having to go back in and put extra human checks in. Oh, don't say this.
Yeah.
Like if you find yourself talking about the Nazis as being great, stop.
Yeah, exactly. And they've already done that.
Yeah, they already have.
Yeah.
But that's, in a sense, that's not AI.
Yeah.
Like those guardrails are humans making value decisions and then just putting them into the program. So I mean, AI is gonna mean that professors in the humanities can't set basic essays and composition, because AI can just do that. But that's good. Like if we can have something that takes the boring regurgitation of information out of everybody's lives, then it frees us up to do the more interesting stuff.
And that's why I personally call AI augmented intelligence and not artificial, because artificial gives it a very negative connotation. So I personally always refer to it as augmented intelligence. Because that's what I think it is, and if you all started looking at it that way, then this exactly thing what you think starts happening. That it starts helping us in achieving more.
Augmenting our intelligence. I think you're absolutely right.
पहले हमारे हमजा साहब इंशाल्लाह एक सवाल और करना चाह रहे हैं, ये आखिरी सवाल है। हमजा का जैसे मैंने आपको पहले तारुफ कराया तो एक दो बात हमारी रह गई थी। इन्होंने माशाल्लाह से बहुत मेहनत से अरबी ज़बान सीखी, उसमें अच्छी महारत हासिल की और तर्जुमा वगैरह कुरान का भी, और अभी इनकी इतनी अरबी अच्छी है कि ये गुफ्तगू भी कर सकता है। और अपना सवाल बताएं।
We left this one out, but what are the causes of religious hatred in the West? Do you think? Doesn't man need spirituality and religion?
What's the second bit?
Doesn't man need spirituality and religion?
Yeah, I mean, put it this way: like growing up in the north of England, where in a very undiverse community, like everybody was white, everybody was basically. There were some Catholics, like that was diversity. It was like, oh, there are some, white Catholics as well as the white Protestants. But nobody goes to church, right? I mean, church going in the UK is like going down. In fact, when I was just at home with my dad showed me and I only ever went to church with like Cub Scouts because we had to go every Sunday. And then my dad only went to church because you had to get the vicar to sign a piece of paper to get into the good school.
Wow.
And then as soon as I got in, he stopped going. Don't quote me. And then, so my dad shows me this piece of paper. The church has sent out an advert saying if the community doesn't pay, we will not have a vicar in the church, and we will just close it up. And it was saying, hey, you will people get married here, people want to be buried here, but no one's coming and no one's paying. So we're going to because the Church of England, like the central thing, doesn't have the money to pay for vicars everywhere. So, it's going to close, people. And that's kind of where, it is where I grew up. But then America, in America, you know, religion is much more alive. Like the Stanford undergraduate body, the Christian, like, I don't know, not activism, but like there's a lot of Christian different denominations that are very active. People, it's a big part of people's lives. I've spent the last year, again, on this Muslim Arab Palestinian Communities Committee where all my colleagues are Muslim. And, you know, Islam has, you know, been a huge part, is a huge part of their lives and has consequently been a large part of my life. This is the year in which I've spent this is the year in America that I spent most time with Muslim colleagues. So Eid has been a big deal. Ramadan was a big deal. Like the sort of rhythms of life of fasting, you know, have been part of my professional life. So I would say in America, you don't get that. In California, I don't get that sense of like a loss of religion or spirituality. Like I kind of spend a lot of time with people who are religious and spiritual, mostly Muslims at the moment. But, you know, I know from reported fact that if I was on, I don't know, the Christian Communities Committee, there would be a lot of people for whom, you know, religion and spirituality was really central. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think it's the same answer that I gave earlier. You know, there's this sense in which people tend to, you know, get into groups and exclude others. It's kind of it's like a human problem. You know, no
Makes
question
sense.
about it. And there's plenty of exclusion and violence and racism and hatred in America. Like plenty.
Fair enough. Thank you.
मैं उमर साहब का बहुत शुक्रगुजार हूँ जिनकी तवस्सुत से हमें प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर साहब से हमारी मुलाकात हुई और उनसे मुस्तफ़ीद होने का मौका मिला। तो मैं उमर साहब से ही गुजारिश करूँगा कि वो एक आखिर में कलिमात तशक्कुर अदा करें।
Shukriya. Thank you. So thank you, Alexander. It's been a wonderful afternoon, a beautiful conversation. I'm sure each one of us in this room is walking away with a lot of new knowledge. And I loved one of the things that you said, that when you disagree, it leads to knowledge. We may have disagreed on certain things. We may not have spoken about it, but I think at the end of the day, what matters is that we're walking away with a lot more knowledge. So thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have you in Pakistan. And I hope you have a good stay and look forward to having you here again next time you come.
It's
Thank
an
you very
honor and a
much.
privilege.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.